Chapter 14, The Animals. Tuesday. It's not often I wake up at 6 in the morning and find I've overslept, but it happened to me on my second morning at Polyface. By the time I hauled my 6-foot self out of the 5-foot bed in Lucille's guest room, everyone was already at work. In fact, morning chores were nearly done. Shockingly, chores at Polyface start as soon as the sun comes up. Even worse, they start before breakfast, before coffee. I stepped out of the trailer into the warm early morning. Through the mist I could make out the figures of the 2 interns, Galen and Peter. They were moving around on the hill to the east. That's where a group of portable chicken pens sat on the grass. One of the most important morning chores was feeding and watering the chickens and moving their pens. I was supposed to be helping, so I started up the path, hoping to get there before they finished. As I stumbled up the hill, I was struck by how very beautiful the farm looked in the hazy early light. The thick June grass was coated with dew. The bright green pastures stood out against patches of black forest. It was hard to believe this hillside had ever been the gullied wreck Joelle had described at dinner. One type of farming had destroyed the land. Now another type of farming was restoring it. Why did the chicken cross the pasture? By the time I reached the pasture, Galen and Peter had finished moving the pens. Luckily, they were either too kind or too timid to give me a hard time for oversleeping. I grabbed a pair of water buckets, filled them from the big tub in the center of the pasture, and lugged them to the nearest pen. 50 of these pens were spread out across the damp grass. Each was 10 feet by 12 feet wide and 2 feet high, with no floor. Inside each one were 70 broiler chickens. Broilers are raised to be, broiled, or grilled, or fried. The pens are floorless to allow the birds to get at the grass. Joelle had explained that the pens were arranged very carefully. Each one would be moved 10 feet a day. At the end of 56 days, the pens would have covered every square foot of the meadow. 56 days is the amount of time it would take the chickens to grow big enough to be slaughtered. Directly behind each pen was a rectangular patch of closely cropped grass. That was where the pen had been the day before. The ground there looked like a really awful piece of modern art, thickly spattered with white, brown, and green chicken poop. It was amazing what a mess 70 chickens could make in just one day. But that was the idea. Give them 24 hours to eat the grass and fertilize it with their droppings, and then move them on to fresh ground. Joelle moves the chickens every day for the same reason he moves the cows every night. The chicken manure fertilizes the grass, supplying all the nitrogen it needs. But left in one place, the chickens would eventually destroy the soil. They'd peck the grass down to its roots and poison the soil with their hot or nitrogen-rich manure. This is why the typical chicken yard quickly winds up bare and hard as brick. Joelle says the chickens get about 20% of their diet from the fresh grass, worms, grasshoppers, and crickets they find. He also feeds them a mixture of corn, toasted soybeans, and kelp, which we scooped into long troughs in their pens. The chicken feed is one of the only raw materials he buys for the whole farm. The incredible Eggmobile. After we had finished watering and feeding the broilers, I headed up to the next pasture, where Joelle was moving the Eggmobile. The Eggmobile is one of Joelle's proudest innovations. It looks like a cross between a henhouse and a covered wagon from the Old West. The Eggmobile is home to 400 laying hens. On each side of the wagon are rows of nesting boxes. The boxes open from the outside so someone can get at the eggs. Every night the hens climb the little ramp into the safety of the coop, and Joelle latches the door behind them. In the morning he moves them to a fresh pasture. When I got there, Joelle was bolting the Eggmobile to the hitch of his tractor. It wasn't quite 7 a.m. yet, but he seemed delighted to have someone to talk to. Talking about farming is one of his greatest pleasures. In nature, you'll always find birds following herbivores, Joelle explained. In the wild, turkeys and pheasants follow bison herds. In Africa, you'll see birds like egrets perched on the nose of a rhinoceros. In each case, the birds dine on the insects that would otherwise bother the herbivore. They also pick insect larvae and parasites out of the animals' droppings. Howell climbed onto the tractor, threw it into gear, and slowly towed the rickety henhouse 50 yards or so. He placed it in the middle of a paddock where his cattle had been 3 days earlier. It seems the chickens don't like fresh manure, so he waits 3 or 4 days before bringing them in, but not a day longer. 3 days is ideal, he explained. That gives the larvae a chance to fatten up nicely, the way the hens like them, but not quite long enough to hatch into flies. Fly larvae may not seem appetizing to you and me, but that protein-rich diet makes the chicken's eggs unusually rich and tasty. The sanitation crew. Once the eggmobile was in position, Howell opened the trapdoor, and an eager, noisy parade of Barred Rocks, Rhode Island Reds, and New Hampshire Whites filed down the little ramp, fanning out across the pasture. The hens picked at the grasses, but mainly they were all over the cow pats. They performed a crazy kind of dance with their claws to scratch apart the caked manure and expose the meaty grubs within. I'm convinced an eggmobile would be worth it even if the chickens never laid a single egg, Howell told me. Because of the chickens, Howell doesn't have to treat his cattle with toxic chemicals to get rid of parasites. This is what Howell means when he says the animals do the real work on his farm. I'm just the orchestra conductor, making sure everybody's in the right place at the right time. Eggs bring in more money than anything else Howell sells. To take advantage of that, most farmers would buy more chickens to lay more eggs. But Howell knows if he added a lot more chickens to the farm, it would throw the system off balance. Too much chicken manure could kill the grass. Suddenly, the manure would become a waste product. Plus, where would the new chickens get larvae for their protein? Howell would have to buy more cows. But how could he grow enough grass to feed them? It's all connected, he told me. This farm is more like an organism than a machine, and like any organism, it has its proper scale. A mouse is the size of a mouse for a good reason, and a mouse that was the size of an elephant wouldn't do very well. Letting chickens be chickens. Most industrial farmers don't worry about keeping things in balance. Their main concern is paying for inputs and getting the most possible outputs. If that means forcing cows to eat corn, even when it is unnatural for them, then that is what must be done. At Polyface, the Salatines try to work with the natural instincts of their animals, not against them. When Howell lets his chickens loose in a pasture, he is using their natural instinct to clean up after herbivores. The chickens get to do and eat what they evolved to do and eat. Instead of treating chickens as egg-laying or meat-growing machines, Polyface honors their inborn chickenness. It is the same for all the animals on the farm. The Salatines also raise rabbits. Like the hens, the rabbits spend part of their time in portable rabbit hutches in the pastures. The rest of the time, they live in cages suspended over a deep bedding of wood chips. The wood chips are home to earthworms, and of course, there are hens loose in the wood chips eating the worms. The scratching of the hens turns the chips and the rabbits' nitrogen-rich urine into valuable compost. The Polyface turkeys also spend time in the pastures. They are moved every 3 days. Howell has built them a movable shade mobile, which he calls the Gobbledy-Go. The turkeys rest under the Gobbledy-Go by day and roost on top of it at night. Howell likes to put his turkeys in the orchard where they eat the bugs, mow the grass, and fertilize the trees and vines. Putting turkeys and grapevines together means getting 2 crops off of the same piece of land. During the winter, the cows and other animals come off the pastures and into the barns. But Polyface's beyond organic methods don't stop, they just move indoors. The cow barn is a simple open-sided structure where the cattle eat 25 pounds of hay and produce 50 pounds of manure each day. Water makes up the difference. Howell just leaves the manure where it falls. Every few days he covers it with a layer of wood chips or straw. This layer cake of manure, wood chips, and straw gradually rises beneath the cattle. By winter's end, the bedding and the cattle can be as much as 3 feet off the ground. As the manure wood chip mix decays, it heats up, warming the barn. Howell calls it his cattle's electric blanket.